Good evening, everybody. Good evening, Professor Thapa.
Good evening.
There are still people coming in. Shall we give them another 2, 3 minutes or should we just begin? Because we are already 2 minutes late than schedule.
Well, if you think we're going to carry on for 90 minutes,
Professor
then I
Thapa,
think we can give them 2 minutes.
there are still people coming in. Shall we give them another 2, 3 minutes or should we just begin? Because we are already, sorry, that was YouTube Live repeating me. Okay, I think we should start. Once again, good evening and a very warm welcome to all. It's a pleasure to see so many participants. I think we're expecting many more still because we had about close to 300 registrations, and I see 1/3 of the people here so far. So on behalf of History for Peace, I would like to thank Professor Thapa for doing this for us and for all of you for being here. And a very special thanks to all those who submitted questions for this evening's interaction. The response actually was quite overwhelming, and covering all the questions in one evening's 90-minute session is a Herculean task, which only Professor Thapa can manage, I think.
I'm not sure.
So what we've done with her guidance is we've tried to consolidate all the questions that we received into broad thematic groups, namely nationalism, politics of ancient India, school textbooks, modern technology in ancient India, research and historical methods, and migration. These groups, we hope, will address all the queries that had come in. I don't think Professor Thapa needs any introduction. And in any case, if I try to do the introduction, I'll eat up half of the time that we have. But I do want to say that perhaps the only historian in the country who has made the study of history extremely accessible for people like us who are not even history students.
No, not true.
So I am not going to waste any more time, and I will now request my colleague Rajasmita to take over and plunge headlong into the first set of questions on nationalism. Rajasmita, please.
Thank you, Megha, and good evening, Professor Thapar, and good evening, everyone present here. As Megha just mentioned, we are going to try and cover as much ground as possible, and I'm very confident we will be, since we have Professor Thapar with us this evening. So without further ado, the first subtopic that we have, so as is already mentioned, we are going to, it's been clubbed into different thematic subheads with Professor's guidance. So the first one that we have is nationalism, and I'm going to try and read out the questions that we have put together under this one. Is there a fundamental difference in the way that nationalism is conceptually understood by political scientists and historians? If so, is nationalism a crucial tool in building historical consciousness? Which time should be considered as threshold time in ancient Indian history? How could we counter the influence of extremist ideologies in their attempt to reshape Indian history? And finally, could you comment on the theory of syndicate Hinduism? Professor Thapar, if we could invite you to comment on this, please.
Well, good evening, everybody. Nice to be here, and I'm trying to persuade myself to get ready for the guillotine. 90 minutes of intensive questions, and I'm really not sure that I can cover all these questions. They are enormous. The scope is most impressive, but I think we would probably need 3 or 4 sessions to go through them bit by bit. But let me give it a try. So we begin with nationalism. Is there a fundamental difference between the political science approach to nationalism and history? I wouldn't say that there's a fundamental difference, but I think there is a difference in the sense that political scientists tend to see nationalism as something that belongs to the here and now, that is constantly coming up and that is constantly undergoing change. We as historians tend to see it as a kind of major historical phase that has characterized modern history. And therefore, we have a slightly more long term view of it. And we see it, in a sense, changing, evolving, developing, uh, picking up the kinds of connections that have really made it into such a powerful concept in the modern world. So let me begin as a historian would begin with a little bit of the history of when it starts and how it comes about and so on. It demarcates the modern period from what is generally called the medieval, and recently there's been the intervention of the early modern between the medieval and the modern. But that's a nicety which not everybody observes. The point that needs to be made very strongly is that nations did not exist in the pre-modern period. The concept of the nation is essentially that comes with the process of what we call modernization. I'm saying this very emphatically because there's a tendency to say, oh, yes, the X nation goes back into history for so many centuries, it's age old, it's traditional, etc., etc. No, this is not so. The nation is recent in historical terms. It's about 2 to 3 centuries old. What is it? What is a change that it marks? It reflects the emergence of the idea of a nation state. Now, this again has a certain history to it. We historians talk about the typologies of states, the different kind of states that have existed in history with different forms of governance. And so we go back to things like clan and tribal systems, changing over to kingship. Kingship in the Indian case, very often accompanied by caste. Then there are varieties of kingship, degrees of governmental control over administration and revenue. The whole discussion of whether, in fact, some of the kingdoms in the medieval period can be called feudal societies and feudal kingdoms with a very particular kind of setup. Again, where the control lies very much in the hands of a small group of people. And in what one calls the South in the world, the ex-colonies, there is also historically a colonial period, but it's limited to certain areas of the world. And in a sense, whereas in places like Europe, the concept of nationhood, nationalism, comes through the evolution of institutions and changes in society. In the colonial world, it generally takes off through an anti-colonial philosophy and practice, which then becomes anti-colonial nationalism. And nationalism as such comes into existence after the colonial control has been got rid of. So there is a certain typology of nations, of states, in which the nation state is the current kind of state that is associated with nationalism. What then are the changes in the phase of moving towards a nation state? Now, here again, the historical question takes preeminence over the questions that perhaps a political scientist would ask. We notice that when concepts of nationalism begin to get spoken of, when the nation is conceived of, there is the concept of territory. What is the territory that is being discussed? And who are the inhabitants? Who are the people in this territory who are being discussed? It assumes, of course, the collapse of the monarchical state. Kings don't exist anymore. Divine right of rulership doesn't exist. And elections of representatives representing public opinion and people begin to take a much more frontal position. Now, this coincides with very fundamental changes that are taking place otherwise in society. It coincides with the period of the change to industrialization and the emergence of capitalism. Who controls the new economy? Who finances industry and commerce? And a new ideology that pertains to a group that emerges at this time socially, the middle class. You do not have middle classes in pre-modern societies. You only have the middle class emerging in a situation where there is a move towards nationalism. The political forms then that are discussed are democracy, because democracy means the representation of citizens, and the relationship of the citizen and the state becomes a fundamentally different relationship from what has been there before. One's had all these relationships of slaves and free men, of lords and serfs, of the employer and labor, of colonial power and the colonized and so on. The characteristic of the nation state and of modern nationalism is that it consists of a state to which citizens owe allegiance. Citizens are not subjects. Citizens are free people, and their freedom is expressed through their relationship with the state, which is a relationship of rights. Citizens have rights. Citizens never before in history have had rights of this all-inclusive, pervasive kind as they have, at least in theory, today. And these rights are generally consolidated into a kind of contract, which frequently takes the form of a constitution. So the constitution is absolutely fundamental to the concept of a nation, which is why there is such consternation these days about defending the constitution. The rights and the duties of the citizen are laid out in the constitution, and the rights and the duties and obligations of the state are also laid out in the constitution. And these mutual rights and duties are extremely central to the idea of the citizen. This is something, again, that I want to emphasize because it's not always understood. There's a kind of vague feeling that, all right, we've changed from not having kings, we've got elected representatives and we've got political parties, but fundamentally the position remains the same. Those in power treat those without power as subjects. We don't today regard the government as the servant of the people, which is what is implied in a lot of the thinking around the question of citizenship. And this is a very fundamentally different concept. How are these rights expressed, controlled, ensured? Sometimes they're spoken of as coming from the three pillars of the Constitution: the legislature, which has the representatives of the people; the executive, which is the functioning body of administration, maintaining law and order and ensuring that the rights are carried out; and the judiciary, which prevents any kind of contradiction of these rights, which is there to keep the balance, as it were, between the other two as well. Now, the emphasis in all of these, you will notice that I have not used the word religion anywhere. The emphasis in all of these is secularity. The democracy that is implied in this change of governmental form to a republic is a secular democracy. And by secular, what is meant is that all citizens are equal. No body of citizens, no community, however they identify themselves, can regard themselves as superior. This is absolutely essential. The first loyalty of the citizen is not to the community, but to the state. It also implies the opening up of all levels of society, especially the lower levels. And it also brings in a whole variety of new cultures, what is sometimes referred to as cultural nationalism. There has been, since the 17th, 18th centuries, much discussion on the question of what are nations. Sometimes it was said these are just a conglomeration of people. Other people have said people in a specific territory, and so on. There's been a lot of discussion. What has been emphasized, whether one's looking at John Locke or Tom Paine or Jean-Jacques Rousseau, what has been emphasized is the sovereignty of the people and the rights of the citizens. These are issues that differentiate modern society from pre-modern society. And we, at our stage, have to understand this differentiation and appreciate it. It's a very major historical change. And of course, there have been a lot of theories about how nationalism came about and what is the most important aspect. And various people have written at length, and I just mention a few people that I think are useful. A.D. Smith, who wrote a book called Theories of Nationalism on the origins of nationalism. Ernst Gellner, who also wrote about how nationalism consists of social and other units that come together, and asks the question whether it is the mandate of the hegemonic. Those in authority, are they the ones who are in control? To which the answer has been given by many others that although the leaders of some communities may set themselves up as being in control, in fact, the control is extensive and it is the people's representatives who are in control. The most useful book that I found on the subject, brilliantly written, was Eric Hobsbawm's Nations and Nationalism, where he argues this position of how you cannot take nationalism back to pre-modern times. It is very much a modern entity, and he defines it in those terms. And the other book that I was also very interested in reading was Benedict Anderson, whose book Imagined Communities is largely arguing that that nationalism brings to the surface a whole body of communities who are socially constructed, but who don't actually exist in reality. They are imagined communities. And what has given a lot of credence to this idea of nationalism and the importance of nationalism is not just that a lot of nations are going through this kind of historical phase, but we all learn from each other ever since the technology of printing came into existence, because of course books on nationalism have been very widely read. What then can one say about about historiography and historical writing and nationalism in India? The first mention of it is in a book written by James Mill in 1817. Now, Mill is reflecting European ideas on the subject, but applying them to the Indian landscape. The History of British India, where he speaks of two nations, the Hindu and the Muslim. It's a moot question of whether he's defining nations as people and people alone, or whether he's defining it as people and territory. This is debatable. But anyway, there is mention made of this, and somehow that concept of the Hindu nation and the Muslim nation took root in thinking about India. The next phase of important, apart from colonial historiography, the next phase of important historical thinking in India was that of the nationalist historians. They pick up this idea of the Hindu and the Muslim nations. And the initial periodization of Indian history, as some of you might recollect, was the Hindu period, the Muslim period, and the British period. But that was then done away with at a certain point when people realized that it was quite untenable, and it gave way to ancient, medieval, and modern. But the periodization was based on the same issues, the supposedly the terminal points of a Hindu-dominated period, then came a Muslim-dominated period, and then came the British. Another aspect of nationalist historiography was, of course, the emphasis on the Aryans, the superior people who are the Aryans, and they speak an Indo-Aryan language which belongs to the family of Indo-European. So this gives a certain superiority and base to the Indo-Aryan people. Technically, the correct phrase is the Aryan-speaking people, but the shorthand is Aryan. The nationalist historians accept this. They also work out a golden age, the age of civilization, which for them was the Gupta period. It was the Hindu Renaissance after the long hold of Buddhism and Jainism. It saw the highlight of Sanskrit literature, both in texts of the humanities and texts of the sciences. And it was described generally as an age of great prosperity. And this was particularly underlined, and it was argued that in the 19th and 20th centuries, the Indian economy declined and India became impoverished because of colonialism, the famous drain theory of Dadabhai Naoroji, as against the early period when it was an age of great economic prosperity. Now, the point, of course, is, as one looks at the way in which different categories of historians have used nationalism, the point is, as very elegantly stressed by Eric Hobsbawm, who argues that history is essential to nationalism in the same way, he says, as the poppy is essential to the opium addict. It is a fundamental part of the desires, the aspirations, and the kinds of ideologies that are being written about at that time. So history is fundamentally important. And this is actually when history does become both important as a subject in education and important as a subject in politics. Because if it's going to be a handmaid to nationalism, it has to have a political role. There is a vision of the utopia that once existed, the golden age, which was an age of tolerance and harmony and non-violence. Now, remember that each time that you think of people today who get up and say that Indian society was always a society in the past of tolerance and harmony and non-violence, they are repeating what was said by the nationalist historians. Many historians subsequently have shown that this was not altogether correct. It was correct up to a point, but not altogether. Nevertheless, it's a nice myth with which we can cajole ourselves that we were once a society that was absolutely tolerant and harmonious and non-violent. The non-violent part is particularly important these days. Is the history that is written then reliable, or does it tend to become the propaganda of a religious nationalism? When I say that does it become the propaganda of religious nationalism, I have to define what I mean by religious nationalism. It's a form of nationalism that took off from colonial writings of colonial writers, of Mill and Muller and people like that. It does not take off from anti-colonial Indian nationalism. This is the very important point to keep in mind. So what happens is that by the time you get to the 1920s and 30s, there is talk about Islamic nationalism demanding an Islamic state, which comes about in Pakistan. And there is also talk and writing about Hindu nationalism, seeking a Hindu state in the form of the Hindu Rashtra. The question, of course, that is often asked is this nationalism? Is it nationalism where you say that we want a nation state where the priority will be given to a particular religious community, be it Muslim or Hindu or Sikh or whatever it may be? If India is a democracy, then this kind of inequality of status cannot exist. Everybody has to be the same, everybody has to be equal, and the state has to respect that equality. Now, religious nationalism then gives birth to much writing in the 1930s by the leaders of the RSS. And it comes to the fore as the theory of Hindutva. Those who accept the theory of Hindutva, Hindutva as Indian history, they've been arguing for many years now that the definition of the Hindu has to be a person whose ancestry originated in the territory of India and whose religion also originated in the same territory. So these are two very important characteristics of Hindu nationalism, of Hindutva: the ancestry of the person and the religion of the person. Now, they don't go into the details of defining which territory. Is it British India? They don't go back to the ancient past when the territorial boundaries were much more fluid, and we don't know what territory was being spoken of. The basic issue is that all the Hindus who trace themselves back to the Aryan speakers, the superior culture of the Aryans, are indigenous. This has to be argued. They are indigenous to India. They do not come from outside India. This is part of the contention that is going on amongst ancient Indian historians today on this issue of the origins of those who call themselves Arya. And for people who follow the Hindutva theory, it is essential to state that the Aryans are indigenous because they maintain that the Aryan religion is the foundation of Hinduism. Therefore, it has to belong to this territory. And the Hindu people are all descended from the Aryans. Now, the definition of a Hindu, according to them, is one whose origins are very closely related to these questions. And to that extent, one can say that the politicization of ancient Indian history came in a big way with the coming of Hindutva history. Hindutva is an ideology that I have called syndicated Hinduism. Why have I called it that? Because it is in many ways a departure from what we have always defined and accepted as the Hindu religion. Please remember in all these discussions about nationalisms, communities, and so on, diversity in itself is not enough. One has to look for the equal status of diverse groups. It's the same with the coexistence of religions and secularism. Coexistence is not enough. It has to be that every religion has equal status. People of that religion are treated as equal citizens. the question of equality is extremely fundamental to the differentiation. So I speak of syndicated Hinduism in terms of a body, an ideology that has taken certain concepts and made them into a creed or a code. It talks about the very distinctive separation of all kinds of Hindu thinking from other kinds of thinking in India, which is historically not absolutely correct. I mean, there was distinctive Hindu thinking, but there were all kinds of other schools that had a mixture of other kinds of thinking as well. Those should also come in. It also emphasizes the centrality of a single sacred book, rather like the religions of the book, the Bible and the Quran and so on, but it's very difficult to agree on a single sacred book. There was a time when the Gita was the book that was used in the courts of law to swear an oath on, but not everybody accepts that, so that is problematic. But here you do have very clearly the politicization of Hinduism. And the change that has come into historical thinking in the last 50 years, 60, 70 years or so, since the middle of the 20th century, is the shift that history has taken, particularly pre-modern history, from being a part of Indology to being a part of the social sciences. What do I mean by that? History is today accepted as one of the disciplines of the social sciences, and it's related to sociology, economics, anthropology, demography, you name it, all the other disciplines of the social sciences. What does this mean? It doesn't mean just a rebunching of disciplines. What it means is that the kinds of questions that historians are asking and the kinds of themes that they're interested in now are themes which have their parallels in the other social science studies. Now, what do I mean by that? What I mean is that in the last 50, 60, 70 years, we have seen major changes in the study of society, for instance. The emphasis has been not simply on saying what the Dharma Shastras are saying is the picture of ancient society. It's a questioning of the Dharma Shastras. Why are they saying this? Why are they constructing Indian society in a particular way? And the very crucial question, which is how many people actually accepted this and behaved and according to these laws and practiced these laws? Can we tell? Do we know? Because the data is, of course, limited for the ancient period. The other big change has come in the studies of the status of women, where previously it was always held by nationalist historians that, oh, women had a very high status in ancient India. They were regarded almost as deities and they were worshipped and so on. Yes, there were many female goddesses who were worshipped. In fact, there is almost a correlation between the number, the respect that is given to goddesses and their worship, and perhaps the laws that restrict the movements and the articulation of women. There is a correlation between the two, but never mind. But what has happened now is that we have started asking questions about the status of women, the same questions in a way, or similar questions to the ones that have been asked by sociologists and social anthropologists and so on, which brings a greater reality into the study of the status of women. It's no longer a question of these are the texts and people must be conforming to the texts. It's a question of, are they conforming to the texts? And if they are not conforming to the texts, what are the rules and regulations that they're living by? Which is, of course, a very, it's not only a very serious question, but it's a question that takes you in a very different direction from simply saying, these are the texts and they describe what society was like. Similarly, with the economy, we talk about different phases in different parts of the country. There are different phases. People move sometimes from being agro-pastoralists, as were the Indo-Aryan speakers, to becoming agriculturalists and undertaking a much more agrarian economy, to becoming traders and urban professionals using occupations of urban life. And then there was this great big discussion on feudal society and feudal economies. Did these exist in the Indian context or not? And it was a very, very interesting, long discussion by economic and social historians of the period from about the late first millennium AD, coming right up to 1,000 years to the late second millennium AD. And then, of course, there's been a lot of discussion on the colonial economy and how has the colonial economy changed different aspects of society. Now, the interesting thing is that as far as the study of social and economic history goes, there is no doubt that the intensive questioning of society and economy in the modern period is accepted, has become normal now, and everybody accepts it as the way of proceeding. But when it is applied to pre-modern societies, people start saying, but there was always caste, there was always religion, there was always something else, and this doesn't really quite apply. And one really is battling at the moment to establish the fact that it is as legitimate to talk about the fundamental social and economic forms of pre-modern societies from early times right up till the 17th, 18th centuries, as it is to talk about modern colonial societies. Now, all of this has a fallout effect on other things as well. Political systems, were there always kingdoms, as has been assumed for decades in the writing of ancient Indian history? Not only kingdoms, but as you know, every dynasty had the name empire attached to it. So you had the Nanda Empire, the Mauryan Empire, the Satavahana Empire, the Kushan Empire, it went on. The point is that there's a world of difference between a kingdom and an empire. You cannot. Hello? Can you hear me?
Yes, yes, we can now.
Yes, all
Can
right.
everybody please mute themselves and keep yourselves mute, please?
What does that mean?
No, not for you, Professor Thapa. Our participants need to mute themselves.
Okay.
Right, please, sorry, carry on.
All right. So where was I? I've forgotten. Oh, yes. The fallout effect of all this on other aspects of life. Political systems, for example. Yes, I was talking about kingdoms and empires and saying that they're very, very different. So you cannot simply add empire to every dynastic name and say that they were empires. So what were these political systems? You had republics, as they've been called, and we prefer to call them chiefdoms these days, clan societies, lineage societies, without kings as such, governed by the dominant families and that kind of thing, the Ganarajyas, as they are frequently referred to. And then you had a gradual transition from this system to kings, to kingship, And then there were varieties of kingships, in the sense that not every kingdom was an exact copy of the next kingdom next door. They were very varied in range and extended over a big range. And so it went on until finally you had the whole colonial system, the anti-colonial movement, and now we are a republic. We're no longer a conglomeration of kingdoms. We are, in fact, a republic. Now, the one area that people hesitate to accept was also influenced by all these many changes in Indian history from the beginning is the area of religion. Now, do remember that the important issue is that religions are not static. Religions grow out of social situations and social requirements. They relate to social requirements. They relate to individual requirements which individuals may set up new sects and new religions. But basically, there is a social context. By social, I mean social, economic, and everything else, using it very broadly. There is a social context to the rise of every religion, as indeed there is a social context to the decline of every religion. The question that remains completely unanswered today, well, not completely, but still largely unanswered, is why did Buddhism decline in the Indian subcontinent? And it went out and flourished hugely in the rest of Asia. It became the major Asian religion. But in India, it declined. These are very important historical questions. You can't just pass them by. And so even the history of religion then is affected by the fact that religions begin to develop social institutions. Institutions of asserting their authority, grants, donations, pilgrimage centers, temples, vihars, mux. These are all institutions that religion creates. Educational institutions are extremely important because, as we all know from the extensive writing of the Jesuits in Europe, the major channel of socialization of a whole generation to a society is through education. So education is very important. And therefore, one is interested to try and discover to what extent which religion controlled what kind of education in particular areas. These are all very valid questions. Now, let me just end with one little statement, which is that much of this kind of change that I've been talking about, which has been happening in Indian history, is often dismissed, abused, attacked by trolls and by others who behave like trolls but shouldn't. They're certainly better people than trolls. And the reason for the attack is the attack that they use is to dismiss all of it as Marxist. It's all these leftist historians that are cooking up fantasies and making history into something which it isn't. Let me assure you that these changes that are taking place are not ipso facto Marxist. They're neither Marxist, nor Weberian, nor Durkheimian, nor any other ist that exists in the repertoire of the social sciences. What is happening is that the insistence on trying to understand and explain the past has taken us in directions much more exploratory than the directions that existed 100 years ago. This is normal. All knowledge expands, increases, has to be questioned, and so on. And that has happened in history. Now, if you wish to dismiss this change, dismiss it openly and argue for an alternative explanation, but don't just abuse it. I'll stop there and wait for the next one. The next question.
Rajasvika.
Sorry, it took me a bit to be unmuted. My computer wasn't allowing me to do that for myself. But thank you so much, Professor, for really unpackaging and historicizing this term that we use ever so often now, this big word nationalism. Also, really bringing out the intricate and critical differences in the way in which a political scientist could look at it vis-a-vis a historian, and also really pointing out the transition, the journey that history as a discipline in itself has made in being from being a part of Indology to now being treated as part of the social sciences, and in the hope of not being boxed in under these labels that you pointed out towards the end, we'll move on to the next set of questions. And since we've been talking, and since Professor Thapar has mentioned historiography quite extensively, even in this one, this would probably be a good time to look at our next subtopic, which is broadly called school textbooks, and the discipline of history as emerging from there, the conversations emerging out of these spaces and these textbooks. So here we go. How can the school history teacher balance all the many challenges of a linear textbook?
Here we go. All right.
Am I audible? Am I audible?
Do I go?
Yes, Professor Thapar, please do.
Okay. All right. All right. Let me begin talking about school textbooks. I was asked to write school textbooks for class 7 and class 8 before any of you were born in 1964 and 65, which is when I wrote them. Absolutely amazed that I should have been asked, since I'd never written a school textbook in my life and didn't know how to go about it. But still, I took a couple of classes in a school and then started writing, and then I tried out what I'd written as well. I found that it was difficult to discover themes that would hold attention and then go on and narrate them in a way that the students would understand, and also entice them into taking a greater interest in the subject. I tried teaching my books, perhaps not so successfully, but I learned a lot from that little trial. You have to make the subject immediate, and you have to play with explaining names, places, landscapes. You have to make analogies with the world that is surrounding us. This, I think, is an absolute constant for all school children, that you're constantly making a connection with the world around them and suggesting that that connection is important to the whole question of study and to history. It's much easier to do with something like archaeology because it's based on technology and objects which can be handled, which can be seen, which can be picked up, and so on. Pottery, for example, absolutely crucial to understanding archaeology. And most school children are very intrigued as to why adults like us should be running around digging up broken pottery. Now, this is a very nice way of starting to explain how even a potsherd, a bit of broken pottery, is imbued with history. And how is it imbued with history? One talks about wheel-thrown pottery. I mean, admittedly, the urban child would probably have never seen today a potter on a wheel throwing pottery. But nevertheless, it's an idea that has to be explained, that wheels are not only wheels on carts and carriages and cars and buses, but wheels can also be used for other purposes. The whole point that I'm trying to make is that the difference between, for example, history and maybe some other discipline, is that history is very all-inclusive. It's constantly making you aware of every little thing around you. And that is something that you have to exploit absolutely fully when you're teaching children. That awareness has to come, that this world is impinging on them. Now, apart from actual objects and so on, there is a problem of concepts. You talk about, or I talk about the Aryans being pastoralists. What does that mean? So you have to explain what that means. Involves their livelihood, a picture of their livelihood, of their social status, of the objects they lived with, their religion, and in what way are they different from us? This is a very interesting question that comes up again and again in all historical periods. In what way is it different from us? And this sometimes catches interest and imagination and makes people think very, very differently. If concepts are to be explained fully, then they do brighten up the understanding and the interest. Now, I mentioned in that lecture that I gave, when some of you have picked it up, the business of suspicion. How does one convey that you approach knowledge appreciatively, yes, but also suspiciously? You have to ask it questions. You have to challenge it all the time. And I'm talking about all knowledge, not just history. Because if you don't challenge it, and if you're not suspicious of what is being told and convinced by what is being told to you as the answer, you will really not get much out of that. So you do that by explaining that in any subject, this kind of asking of these kinds of questions is extremely important and necessary. I remember even at the MA stage when I had students coming in and saying, what shall we do as our first reading? And I would say to them, go and get a novel by Agatha Christie, any, and read it, a detective novel. And they'd look at me aghast and say, you know, what are you suggesting? And I would say, because the historian is a detective, basically. The historian is looking at the past and is looking at a situation in the past and saying, how do I make sense of this? And how do I solve the problem? How do I make this relevant? It is detective work and it is important. How do you make history relevant? You make the children understand, or the students, if they're of a higher class, understand how the past is relevant to the present. The past brings you into the present in a way, and the present is connected with the past. Look at your surroundings. They reflect the past. Look at yourself in the midst of a family. You have parents, you have grandparents. This is all linking up with the past. Perhaps the children can be encouraged to do a history of their locality. That might create some kind of interest. How does everything relate to everything else? Or they can sometimes take up the history of another country, very distant, very different, about which a curiosity may be aroused. For example, how about getting a bunch of kids to work on Iceland? Or if not Iceland, Nigeria. And if not Nigeria, Trinidad. Trinidad has a certain Indian population as well. How did it get there? I'm suggesting this simply because if you choose a place which is supposedly completely different from yourself, you may be nudged into asking questions. And I'm going on and on saying that asking questions is absolutely crucial. At high school, of course, they can be made to read around historical events and personalities, biographies of people, novels, for example, on the French Revolution. My attitude to the French Revolution became very positive after I read these awful novels of Baroness Orczy, which was very pro the aristocracy and very anti the revolution. And I just automatically became pro-revolution and anti the aristocracy. That kind of thing can happen. The daily newspaper is also a very interesting thing. Pick up the newspaper and pick up an item and say, how does history relate to this? And are you following the connection? And then try and make a connection. And then, of course, there are inevitably the trips to local monuments. Don't make it just a trip. Make them write something on it. Make them do a little bit of sweat and get some information and write it up and see what they make of it. Introduce discussions on how history differs from mythology. Very important. Somebody did ask that question. We tend to confuse the two, and we tend to say that as you go back in time, mythology takes over and history becomes less important. Rubbish. There's always a distinction between mythology and history. Why is there that distinction? Because a myth is fantasy. Anybody can make up a myth and do it any way they like. History is based, we hope, on facts and evidence. And this is a very fundamental distinction. The stories may be quite similar, but nevertheless. And there may be a bit of myth woven into the history as well, which you as a good historian have to separate. Let the students read a myth and see what is unreal about it and how would a historian write it. This might prepare them for asking questions when they see episodes of so-called historical epics on TV. How much of it is actually so, could be so, and how much of it is made up? Should we make them make up myths so that they understand the process and then explain to them how that same process has to be applied to investigating a myth? The reliability of facts, the reliability of evidence is, again, absolutely basic. Evidence has to be checked, even when you're told it's written in a book. That's not good enough. Who wrote the book? Why was it written? What was the purpose in writing it? These are basic questions that we as historians keep on asking our sources. And children who are reading history have to be told that these are the differences between mythology and evidence. History can, up to a point, be taken literally. Mythology must never be taken literally. But symbolically, yes, it has a symbolic role, and that symbolic role can be explained quite sensibly and easily if you analyze a myth with a bunch of kids and tell them, you have this version of the story, but there's also another version which could be this. Introducing the symbolism of a myth and keeping it separate from history can also be fun because your audience has to guess what the symbolism means. And it's not critical, it won't hurt, but it's nevertheless something that they have to guess. It may even carry a secret message that only those who understand the symbols will follow. For example, the Harappan pictograms. We don't understand them. We haven't the faintest idea at the moment as to what they mean. What could they have meant? Can you construct a little mythology, a little story around a collection of 3 or 4 of these symbols and put it together? The other thing is scripts. Very, very interesting. Why do scripts change? You explain to them why they change. How do they change? Take Devanagari, for example. The origins of Devanagari, as far as we can trace them now, are in Brahmi, which came into existence, some say before the Ashokan edicts, and some say just with the Ashokan edicts. That's about the 4th, 3rd century BC. It's written in a particular way. And then there's a version of it called Kharoshti, which is also written in a slightly different way. Write your name in Brahmi, not in Devanagari, but in Brahmi. and see whether it's fun to try and learn another script. Or you can take up a totally different script. Tamil is still very similar, so on. Take up something like Nastanik, the Urdu script, and suggest to them that wouldn't it be fun to write your name in this script and write it for them and see how they react. Now, I'm running out of ideas, but these are only ideas to suggest that you have to get the imagination of children going if you're going to get them interested in the past. The past is too remote. It is too remote for most people anyway, even for most adults. Oh, that's the past, that's done and finished with, it doesn't exist. Our very existence is an indication that there is a past and we are existing. And this coming to terms with understanding, investigating, seeing the symbolism behind the past might just turn out to be quite fun. There was a question connected with this, which I'd like to answer, which said, what about epic compositions? Can we get history from our two epics? Epic compositions were written to glorify heroes, wars, the winning of women, travels. And the historian has also kept to keep in mind that they are not intended to be factual. They are not histories. And even though the Mahabharata calls itself itihasa, it's not serious 20th century historical writing. It is different. There is a lot of fantasy, there's a lot of symbolism, and there's a lot of imagination in the way in which it is being presented. This doesn't mean that we dismiss it. It's written in the form of a poem, and poetry, as we all know, is not always factual. In fact, the best poetry is often not factual. It is again symbolic and it's different. And the other important thing to remember is that the epics are not written at one sitting. It wasn't as if half a dozen poets got together, bards got together and sat down and rattled off the epics and quickly wrote them and produced these huge numbers of volumes of what we now call the Mahabharata and the Ramayana and so on. Epics were written at different periods. Most scholars today, and certainly the editors of the critical editions of both the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, argue that they were composed over a period of 800 years at least, 400 before Christ and 400 after. It's a long period. So we have a lot of interpolations, people adding on bits, accretions. Somebody has a nice story and they say, oh, this should go in very nicely. There's a story in the Mahabharata. Why don't we put it in? And as you know, the Mahabharata is full of, and then I will explain something to you and I'll explain it in the form of a story. And so there's a story told. In the story, someone says, I will explain it to you in the form of a story. And another story is told. And this goes on. It's what we call boxed in stories. It's one box after another, getting bigger and bigger till you come to the main story. So remember that this is a long composition. It has many segments that belong to different periods of time. And it's important to keep this in mind because one doesn't say, oh, the Mahabharata was written in 3102 BC, the whole of it, and therefore it cannot be quoted for a later period. That is nonsense. It was written over a longer period. We shouldn't just pick out information and treat it as factual. We should cross-check it. The Mahabharata says something. Do we have any other source that also says the same thing? In which case it becomes a little more factual, and so on. Today, the big difference between 50 years ago and treating the Mahabharata as factual and quoting from it time and again is that today we begin to see it as not necessarily, perhaps sometimes representing something factual, but not necessarily always, but representing a perspective that people had at that time. The epics then become the kind of texts that tell us how were people thinking about different issues at that time. And therefore they become very important because they give us a kind of general picture of that period, which is in fact extremely important and helps us to compare it with other pictures that we get from other sources as well. Okay, next question.
Thank you so much, Professor, for bringing out the critical differences between history and myth. And also, how does one really read myth and effectively use it in trying to think about the past without really dismissing these entirely. Also, your emphasis on the reading of these two epics that are often spoken about. And finally, also just cross-checking evidence and reading evidence and checking for its reliability, really. And how does one do all of this that we talk about in a classroom is something that only you could have really summed it up so well for us. So thank you for that. The next question, the next set of questions is around modern technology and ancient India. So the first thing under that is, how can modern technology help historians to discover the history of ancient India? How do ecologies figure in reimaginations of history in relation to early India? And finally, how do tools of historiography represent early Indian society?
You know, you guys have, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. You guys have cheated. In one question, you're really asking three questions. It's very difficult for me to answer three questions as one question. But anyway, here we go. The first point I want to make is that when we talk about the assistance of technology in the study of ancient history, we are not talking about were there aeroplanes in that period, were there various other modern contraptions in that period, and that kind of thing. We are talking precisely about how modern technology, the technology that we have today, the scientific knowledge that we have today, can we use that to further explore the ancient past? This is a fundamental difference, and it's a difference that you must keep in mind. Modern technology can only be used, and it can be used to explore the past. Now, I think I can best answer that question by giving you some examples instead of speaking in the abstract. In fact, it is quite amazing how much modern technology is now required to get accurate data on ancient times. In fact, in archaeology, it's got to the point where 100 years ago, you had to have perfect Sanskrit in order to be a good archaeologist. But today, you also have to be a scientist, because so many of the objects that come up are liable to scientific investigation. Just finding a site, for example, we all take, or some of us, take cross-country walks. You walk across the fields and so on and so forth. And you don't really look around and say, could there have been an ancient settlement here? How would you know if there was an ancient settlement? You would know that there was an ancient settlement because there would be a little mound, maybe a small one, not a very high one, a little mound. Why? Because as a dwelling collapses, it collects as wind and rain and dust and mud and everything, and slowly a little mound builds up over the collapsed structures. Now, in the course of the climate, or in the course of centuries, what happens is that the dust, there's rain on it and there's storms and everything, the dust kind of fritters away. And what surfaces is the heavy object, which is a piece of potsherd. So if you're doing a cross-country walk with an archaeologist, you will find the archaeologist constantly looking at the ground and every now and again stretching out a hand and saying, whoop, I found a potsherd. Now, the finding of the potsherd is crucial because that is evidence of that little mound. Is it 18th century? Is it last year's mound? Is it 18th century? Is it 14th century? Is it 6th century? Depending on the kind of pottery it produces. Now, pottery is crucial to archaeology because pottery styles and types change over periods, and there are whole cultures that are identified by pottery. You have the painted gray ware culture, and you have the northern black polished ware culture, and you have the rouletted ware culture, and so on. These potteries are indicators of time periods and cultures. Now, that's one way in which you find a site, and once you found the mound, which has old objects, old bits of pottery, you start excavating. This is not just digging. Excavation has to be done very carefully. It has to be planned and carefully laid out and worked out extremely carefully. Now, these days, they've found an absolutely super technology which costs the earth, but nevertheless has been used, which is a laser photography called LIDAR. Don't ask me what these letters stand for. It's like taking a camera with laser photography on a drone across an expanse of a settled site. And you get a photograph of what is underneath the earth. Now, they did this with the temple of Angkor Wat in Cambodia and discovered that their theory that this was the pinnacle temple that dominated the landscape and there was nothing else around it, just the temple, was shattered when this LiDAR technology revealed a whole city that existed around the temple. So that the temple, the social function of the temple changes to becoming the focus of a huge urban center, which gives a rather different orientation to some aspects of the temple, the social and economic aspects of the temple as against the religious aspects. Similarly, in Mexico, they've used it on a lot of Maya settlements, and they've found huge expanses underneath this rainforest, which they can never hope to clear and to look for things. They suddenly find this new technology is revealing all kinds of things. Now, once it becomes cheaper, then we'll all be able to use it. And so a lot of our sites will be revealed to us. And this is a very ace example of absolutely current modern technology being used in the most ancient, exploring the most ancient sources. The major uses so far have been in dating objects. You've all probably heard of carbon-14, which is measuring a certain organic substance in an object, and that gives you a calculation for a date. Similarly, in pottery, they use thermoluminescence, which is a way in which pottery can be dated. So the dating of objects is something that has been subjected to a lot of this. And also the great new revolution in the study of the Aryans, which is creating havoc all around, genetics. They are now trying to gather DNA samples from burials, Harappan burials, and from various other sources, and work out what was the identity of the population at that time. And so far, one theory that has come up, which is the most commonly quoted one, is that the Harappans had a certain genetic pattern which was indigenous Indian and Iranian, and that the post-Harappans have the entry of a strain of Central Asian people. And this, of course, everybody shouts and says, the Aryans are migrating in. This is now new evidence for that. And those who are against this theory and who insist that the Aryans are indigenous are therefore throwing out the theory as well. But genetics has great potentiality as far as this kind of evidence goes, as far as DNA evidence goes, except that it's very difficult to get DNA evidence, which is not contaminated, because a lot of the DNA evidence is already contaminated. Anyway, that is one possibility. And of course, the other thing that continues apace, the study of plants, of bones, of soil samples, of human hair, of all kinds of things of that kind, which give you clues to the society. You remember what I said about Agatha Christie and the detective? This is where that whole thing comes in again. We are all detectives and we're using every possible technology to try and find clues to what we're looking for. Dating manuscripts is the latest. They found a whole pile of manuscripts with Prakrit Gandhari on and early Buddhist texts in Central Asia, in Afghanistan as well. And these are now being put to technical dating to find the tracking water systems, the hydrology of rivers changing courses, very, very important to tracking migrations of people in ancient times. And the end result, of course, is that one wonders whether what one should train as a historian. Can one just read history, or does one have to read all these other sciences as you go along, because this kind of evidence hits you in the face all the time? But the exciting thing about it is that if one comes across a problem in a material object particularly, one can turn to a scientist and say, can you help me solve this problem? Which one couldn't do in the past. Now you can do it. And that's really very exciting. Okay.
Thank you so much for all of those insights, really. And just the scope of modern technology and its linkages to studying ancient India, as you've described, from dating manuscripts to locating new sites, and of course, this entire conversation around the Aryan race debate, which has once again become alive because of all of this that's available to us now. Now, the next thing that we have is it's been put under the subhead migration and invasion. And the question is, if migration led to a cultural interface between host and foreign societies, and invasions resulted in a face-off between two communities, does that validate the 1200 years of slavery viewpoint about medieval India?
Yes, it's like the DNA and the so-called DNA of the Aryans. This migration and invasion has become another major problem. Let me begin by saying very emphatically, there is a world of difference between migration and invasion. And it is only those who are ignorant who confuse the two. And I'm sorry that there are so many ignorant people who go on confusing the two. An invasion, what is an invasion? An invasion is a massive, large, disciplined force that uses violence, enters a territory, and conquers the people that are living on that territory. Okay? It's large, it's disciplined, it uses force, it uses violence to conquer. This is not a migration by any stretch of the imagination. A migration is the reverse, in fact. It is the coming of small groups of people who bring with them their goods and chattel. They make temporary halts along a route, and they finally settle somewhere where they think it is appropriate for them. Migrants are generally pastoralists. The biggest migrations until recent years, the biggest general migrations have been of pastoralists. Why do they migrate? They're looking for fresh pastures. And it's thought that if the Aryans are taken as pastoralists migrating from Central Asia, they're coming to northern India because there is a drying of the pastures in the Oxus region, and they're slowly migrating to Iran and then on to the upper Indus and Punjab. But there is another category of migrants too, which we generally ignore because we have this romanticism about pastoralists, and that is traders. Traders are also migrants. They move from home country to host country where there's good trade, and they very often settle down in the host country, and they very often create new communities in that country. So these are two very substantial occupations amongst people who are pastoralists. They're not soldiers, they're not fighting, they're not invaders. It's also evident from the examples that we have that sometimes you can have pastoralists that start off by being pastoralists and slowly change into traders. They may even in between join an army and become invaders, but that's not the main thrust. Their main thrust will be that they become traders. For example, as pastoralists, let's take the Kushans. They migrated as pastoralists from north of China to the Oxus region to Bactria, taking their herds of horses and cattle with them, horses and sheep and goats with them. And from there, from Bactria, they then migrate south into northern India. They also invade. And as invaders, they come separately. They don't come as migrants. They don't come as pastoralists or traders. They come as invaders, and they conquer territory. It's a moot question as to whether the people who come as the generals of armies and in the army are the same as the pastoralists or different. Possibly they are different. In the second millennium after Christ CE, Common Era, the Sanskrit texts talk about the coming of the Shakas and the Turushkas. The Shakas are the Shakas, Central Asian people who came just before the Kushans came, so the same term is used. The Turushkas are the Turks. And it's interesting that in the 11th century, Kalhana, who was writing his history of Kashmir, the Raja Tarangani, he refers to the Kushans as Turushkas because he knows the Turushkas, the Turks from Central Asia, and he knows that the Kushans came from Central Asia. So what we call Turks, Afghans, and Mughals today, in the Sanskrit text, they are called Shakas and Turushkas. What's interesting about these terms is that it links the history to earlier periods, which we don't do by calling them Turks and Afghans and Mongols. They come, the Shakas and the Turushkas that come from about the 11th century onwards, they come as invaders, they come as pastoralists, they come as traders, and they come as Sufis. Now, this is a whole range of occupations and interests. They're not just invaders. Please remember, we rush to call anyone who is Muslim, we rush to say they're descendants of invaders. It's the same with the Arabs. Because the Arabs came to Sindh under Muhammad bin Qasim, all Arabs are described as invaders. But in fact, all down the West Coast, you have community after community of people tracing their descents to Arab traders. It was a very, very active trading area right through the centuries. Anyway, so we have them coming as invaders, pastoralists, traders, Sufis. In the period from the 12th century AD, there are many invasions and the setting up of the sultanates in northern India. We forget that at the same time, there is a slow pastoral spread from Kashmir through the Punjab, through Rajasthan into Gujarat of the Gujjar pastoralists, who a lot of people think come from a little further north of Kashmir, Central Asia. But there is that movement going on. There is the intensification of trade between northern India and Central Asia with the opening up of the Silk routes. So the trade that had been started and put into action by the Kushans continues in a bigger way now under the Turushkas, as we call them in our texts. And so there is a meeting of traders, and of course the meeting of traders is always a meeting of cultural interfaces. I mean, cultural interfaces take place with any meeting of two groups of people, but with trade it's very often much more intimate and much more intense. And then you get something that was to make a big difference to religious sects in northern India particularly, but all over in fact, the entry and spread of many schools of Sufi teaching, the Chishtis, the Naqshbandis, you name it, all of them, whose dargahs, whether they're in Punjab or Sindh or anywhere else in the country, are on occasion connected with the bhakti teachers, the bhakti sants, and certainly with the Nath yogis. There is a lot of dialogue between them. And it's a discussion that's going on these days that in some schools, not all, but in some schools of both the Sufis and the Bhakti sants, there may have been an interchange of ideas. Now, the point that I'm trying to make is that it is completely unhistorical to say that the last 1200 years have been a period only of invasions. There's been much more going on, which is of great interest to the historian, other than invasions. So about these 1200 years of a period of slavery, people who say that really neither know anything about slavery and what that means, but I won't go into the technicalities of that, but they certainly don't know their history. We have to ask some basic questions about this period in connection with this particular issue. If it was a period of slavery, and if the Hindus were victimized at every level, everywhere, with no let up, would there have been a bhakti movement of slaves? The bhakti movement is a very vital, it's a very, very vivacious and important religious movement pertaining to the Hindu religion. Would it have been a product of subordinated slaves? Were all these bhakti teachers slaves? One certainly doesn't get that impression. You take the culture of Krishna and the gopis, Krishna and Radha, Krishna and the gopis, which becomes very important from about the 13th century when Vallabhacharya brings it, and when they give the status to Vrindavan as the area where a lot of the Krishna stories take place. Is this a slave culture? Then if you look at the administration of the Sultanate and the Mughals, we find that a lot of the senior officers there are Brahmins, Kshatriyas, and Kayasts. Kayasts particularly because they were, in fact, the professional administrators. At the senior levels of the administration and in the armies, the Mughal armies, for example, are people like Todarmal, Birbal, Man Singh to be called slaves? Were they victimized? They were actually the ones who were dictating policy. And that's what we should be interested in and should take pride in, that a lot of this kind of policy was the combined thinking of these people and the others who were in authority. Would the Mughal emperors, for example, have been taking wives from the families of the royal families of the Kachwaha Rajputs, wives who are respected in the Mughal household as the mothers of successive emperors, if these Rajputs were slaves? And the more important Sanskrit religious texts of this time are being continually translated over the centuries into Persian, and generally at the royal command. The Pandits who are sitting and assisting in this translation, are they slaves? Or are they self-respecting, learned people who are able to look at the translation with authority and supervise it with authority? All I can say to this kind of statement, which is very common these days, is that unfortunately, when ignorance spreads, it spreads like wildfire. And compared to this spread, the spread of knowledge tends to be much more contained, alas. That's my answer.
Thank you. Thank you so much for really getting to the roots of this myth, if I may call it, if this sense of, I don't know if myth is the right word even, but 1200 years of slavery, getting to the roots of where this stems from, and also really debunking it with all these multiple examples, right from the Bhakti movement to the role of people like Birbal and Todarmal in dictating policy, and really also questioning what slave culture was in the first place, and then juxtaposing that with this period could turn out to be extremely problematic. So here are the few options that I have for you, Professor Thapar. I would definitely like to go on and ask one more question on research and historical method. But do you think we should stop here? Would you like to take one last question? Would you like to comment on just anything else that comes to you right now? Entirely up to you.
So I can take one question on historical method.
Okay, so this one question will probably be a clubbing of a few questions since...
Again?
I'm sorry, I'm guilty of having done this to you. But there were just an overwhelming number of questions. So I'm going to try and keep it as short as possible, but I'm not promising very much because this happens to be the largest set of questions that we had to put together under this section. But here it is. If we could now request you to comment on some aspects of research and historical method, namely navigating through the process of research and writing in ancient Indian history, the methodology of reading inscriptions to analyze processes of change, herein the need to be suspicious in reading sources with the specific case of exploring Ashokan edicts effectively. There is a second part of this question which deals with historiography, but I'm going to stay away from that.
All right. Well, I will not answer it in detail, but I will answer it in as much with as much energy as I can muster. All right. The historical method. This is something that I think all of us invented 50 years ago, in the sense that no one talked about the historical method before then. One just talked about writing history. But we were being nasty and introducing method into the writing of history. And this, I hope we have succeeded in doing. I was asked when I was giving a talk on this kind of subject at the Indian Institute of Science, the students there said to me, we all know about the scientific method. That's well established. But who's ever heard about a historical method? So I said, well, I will tell you now what the historical method is. Why do we learn history? We learn it because the past is with us all the time. In fact, we are the past. Sometimes I think looking back for the past is unnecessary because it's within us and we carry on with it. We are a product of the past. And what we have to do is that we have to learn to see it. We have to learn to understand it, to see it, and to explain it. And this is the big difference between the historians of today and the earlier historians who talked about looking at the past and judging the past and making moral judgments on actions of individuals and that kind of thing. That's not what we're interested in. It's enough if we can just explain what happened and tell people what happened. I would say, and maybe I'm being arrogant as a historian, it is also meant to liberate the mind. What do I mean by this? I think history particularly. What I mean by this is that every object in our lives has a history. It either has a history because it was something before and it became something afterwards, or it has a history as an object and has continued over the days, months, and years with us. And we have associations with it as an object, which are historical associations. And we gradually look at the ideas which this liberation of the mind produces in our minds. And we begin to meet the challenge which any new idea produces. Every new idea is a challenge because we have to come to terms with what it's telling us or what it would like to tell us or what it is telling the world around us. And so we have to come to terms with it. And looking at the past and trying to see how the past functioned is also a way of looking at an alternative system that may rediscover history, but may give us some ideas on our own lives. So it's not exactly a neutral, out there discipline. It is a discipline that has a modicum of influence on the way in which we see ourselves. And I would say then that this can be achieved if the research which we carry out is based on critical thinking. And I keep on underlining critical thinking. Let me try and explain in as brief a way as I can what I mean by this, by looking at the process of research. How do historians work? What do they do? First of all, the historian chooses a subject which, to her mind, is a subject that is worth researching on. And she has to convince herself that this is a subject worth researching on. This is not just any old subject. It's fun, it's interesting, I want to know more or whatever, but it's a subject that is meaningful. Okay. By this, I don't mean that it should be a dull subject, but it should be something that excites me as a historian? And what is the basic question that I am going to answer when I ask my sources the question that I will pose? My answers so far may be limited, and I'm looking for answers which are more expansive, which tell me much more. So I ask my question and I go to the sources that I am going to consult. I go to as many sources as possible because eventually I will have to cut out some and stick to the ones that are most relevant. But it's useful to begin with sources that seem unlikely because you never know what they might bring up. This is Agatha Christie coming back again. Very important to look at every possible source. Now, in order to look at sources, the historian must know the language of the sources. And I'm one of these fuddy-duddy historians who, when we set up a department at the JNU, insisted that every single student that took ancient Indian history had to learn Sanskrit or classical Tamil, because the sources that they were going to consult, or the sources that they were only going to be reading secondary works on those sources, nevertheless, they should know something about the language. Why is this important? It's important not just to know the language in order to be able to translate, because you can get very good translations these days, but language has nuances. The importance of language is the nuances. When you say something, the way you say it, it's like when you phonetically say something. I can do it, a sentence. I can do it means something. I can do it means something else. I can do it means something else. I can do it means something else. So the same thing transferred into a text. The nuances that you get from the language are extremely important in understanding what the text is saying. And in any case, our students today begin with one of the preliminaries of the historical method, which is that when you pick up a text as a source, you ask a set of questions. Who is the author? Why has he written this text? What is his agenda? And who is the audience? Very important. It puts the text in context. You're not just reading the text by the way, you're reading it with this purpose in mind. The next stage is to test the reliability of the evidence you're using. This is a stage which many people who write pop history these days do away with. Reliability doesn't matter, you can say what you like. But for the historian, the true historian, reliability of evidence is fundamental. And how do you prove the reliability of evidence? You prove it by examining the source from the point of view of whether or not it is genuine. Are there other sources that say the same thing? Are they reliable? In which case your source can be said to be reasonably reliable. Is there an internal logic in what is being said which makes the statement reliable? Is there a historical likelihood of what is being said actually happening? That also adds to the reliability. And of course, the main question, what is the intention of what is being said? Then we have to go to something that talks about the categories of sources. Texts are one, and the focus is often on style and language and meaning and so on, which is important because it indicates, in a way, the ambience of the period when the text was written. Let me illustrate this with an example. We have the Valmiki Ramayana, which is written in excellent Sanskrit and at a particular period. Most historians would date this to the early centuries of the first millennium BCE. And then we have a Jain version of this story, not of the text, but of the main story, called the Paumacharyam, which is not written in Sanskrit, it's written in Prakrit. And the story differs a little bit. And the interesting question then is, what are the differences in the story? Are these differences because of someone saying, well, I will not write the same story, I will write it differently? Or is it because things are happening differently, which lead the author to write the story in a slightly different way? The point I'm trying to emphasize is that it's very useful to do a comparative study of the same kind of story, text, narrative, source over a period of time to see what the differences are. And you will find that there always are differences. It's a bit like reading Shakespeare's English and reading, I don't know, Hilary Mantel or any of these people who write history today and seeing the difference of language. It's another language almost. And that is the point about every living language, every creative language changes, and the changes have to be observed and seen and understood. This is where inscriptions are different. Now, inscriptions also are of a different category, of various categories as you go along. But generally, they are a little more reliable than just any old text. A historical text is different, but a text in literature, for example, if one was to take an inscription that we all use, the Ashokan edicts, which talk about sects, religious sects, and talk about differences and make a plea for tolerance and harmony. And when we compare these with the Buddhist texts that are written at that time, that talk about the life of Ashoka, such as the Pali Sri Lankan texts, the Dipavamsa and the Mahavamsa, and so on, there is a difference. There is a difference in the way in which he is depicted in these texts, admittedly written much later, and the way in which he projects himself through the edicts. So the inscriptions are different from the texts. The inscriptions possibly are a little more reliable on factual information because they're meant to be records. They are meant to, after all, record the events of a king's reign. But we, of course, know that because they are records and because they are in praise of the ruler, they can be highly exaggerated. And the ruler can be made into something magnificent, which he is not. One indication of this is the lovely situation that occurs in many late post-Gupta inscriptions where small rulers of inconsequence will take exalted titles, Maharaj, Adhiraj, Mahatiraj, this, and it goes on. But nevertheless, it is interesting to compare inscriptions with literary texts because that gives you two different perspectives on a similar period of time. And inscriptions then later on, when they are donatory inscriptions, votive inscriptions of land grants, they are, of course, containing the legal data. So they are very precise and very useful, particularly to economic history, which is different kind of history. Having done this, having secured the evidence and proved it to be reliable, you draw your conclusions, which are causal connections. History is a series of causal connections. It is explaining why something happened. Therefore, why did B arise from A? Why did X give rise to Z? It's these causal connections which are very, very important. And that is where the reliability of your evidence and your sources is crucial, because unless you use reliable evidence, your causal connections will be weak or will be negated. So be very sure that your explanation of whatever is going on, of an event, has to be rational and logical. And I must say that what I often used to tell my students is a key that I use myself, is that the questions that you ask, for example, use the key of using where, no, sorry, what. What is the question? What am I referring to? What am I trying to examine and discover? When did it happen? Because I'm talking about history. Where did it happen? Because locations are very important. If it happens by the sea, it's very different from something happening inland. How did it happen? The procedures, and why did it happen? Now, if you can answer all these questions with some seriousness, you have a reasonably good analysis before you. So try and do that. Now, so much for the method, but the method has to include, does include in all good historical method courses and syllabi, including the one that we had, it includes historiography. Because what is historiography? Historiography is a study of the kind of history that is being written by a historian. It is a study of historians, but it's not personal biographies and a little bit of biodata. It is historians in the context of their thinking times. And when I say thinking times, what I mean is, what was the intellectual context of, let us say, the 1930s, which produced the kinds of history that was being written at that time? Why is it that in the 1930s, the kind of history that is being written in India is hardly nationalist history and then Hindutva history? And in the 1930s, it is this magnificent British socio-economic history. People like Hobsbawm and others of that ilk, Christopher Hill and E.P. Thompson and so on. So the context, the intellectual context in which a historian is living and thinking and writing is very important to understanding why that particular historian writes in a particular way. I mean, in the old days, one talked about intellectual influences, but it is more than intellectual influences. It's really the intellectual context that one is concerned with. And so that makes historiography a slightly complicated procedure. Historians try as they might, and they will not succeed, are expected to be neutral. But no human being is neutral. We all have our prejudices, biases, our perspectives, our opinions, and however much we may try and push them aside, they come creeping back in to a small extent. So if one is doing historiography, one has to be very conscious and aware of these kind of influences on the history that is being written. The liberal arts education is, if it is properly taught, is very important in all of this, because it opens up the world by discussing alternative situations. And these alternative situations are what we're looking at when we're looking at the history of the past. Not consciously trying to discover them, but consciously they are there. Earlier historians used to sit in judgment, and if you read books written in the 1900s, for example, the early 1900s, there's a lot of this business of judging the work of other historians. We would argue today that since we never know the past in any absolute sense, nor can we relive the past cannot be demonstrated, so it's different from a scientific experiment where a situation can be demonstrated. We just have to try and understand and explain what happened. And we can still learn from the explanations that we seek. And we also have to be aware of the fact that the past links up with the present all the time, however much we may push it aside. And I've forgotten who it is. Maybe it was E.H. Carr who said that the best historian is the historian who writes on the past with an eye to the present. Now you can interpret that as you will, but if you see it from this point of view, it's an interesting statement from a leading historian. Of course, one of the things that one must keep in mind is whatever explanation one finds of the past, it is not the end of the story. History has no closures. The explanation may change. There may be new evidence. The discovery of the Indus Valley civilization changed our attitude to the origins of Indian civilization. There may be new methods of analyzing it. Like I mentioned, 50 years ago, we talked about the historical method. Within that historical method, which we historians of my generation thought were very avant-garde and at the cutting edge of the frontiers of knowledge, today we are regarded as people that belong to the backbenchers because there are other people who are writing and who are presenting history in ways which is different, intellectually different. So there is always that new aspect that comes into explanations, and we have to consider that. We have done it, for example, when I talked about the changes that took place in pre-modern history, two areas where this is very clearly a major change: the kinds of studies that are made on the status of women, much more analytical, much more intensive than what was done in pre-1950, and studies of the role of caste in ancient Indian society, which is again something very different from the way it used to be. Historiography, therefore, is very important to the historical method, should be studied, and it is all about how historians have written history. What is the intellectual perspective of the historian? What is the context in which he or she is writing? What is their own take in understanding that context? And does this take in understanding the context change the perspective of the historian? And the good historian is the person who understands his or her perspective on the past. That's it.
Thank you so much for everything, really. A few points from this one to thank you for spelling out the cruciality of reading the language of sources in such great nuances for us, for establishing that history must be looked at as a series of causal connections, and finally your emphasis on understanding that history has no closure. which probably is a good point for us to bring this conversation to a close. And I don't know what to say. Thank you for taking out your time to really answer this huge canvas of questions in so much detail. And before I give it back to Megha, just to say what a pleasure and privilege it has been for me to share this conversation with you today.
Well, I'm willing to share a secret with you that I really did enjoy it myself.
Thank you so much. That's quite a secret I'm going to treasure.
What can I say? I mean, saying thank you seems very inadequate considering the sheer depth and breadth of ideas that we've been exposed to in just, the past couple of hours or less. And I think some of the participants over here must be really missing the annual history conference in Calcutta, where, at least I am, where, you get the opportunity to interact live. But thank you so much, Professor Thapar. This has really, really been very, very valuable. And before we end this session, I would like to make two announcements. One of them is a very exciting news that I would like to share, which is Seagull Books is publishing an extremely pertinent, timely, and important essay by Professor Thapar, Voices of Dissent. And allow me to very briefly share my screen over here right now. Scheduled for release in October 2020. This essay looks at the long history of non-violent expressions of dissent in the subcontinent, from Vedic times to Shaheen Bagh, shattering the myth that suggests that the concept of dissent has been imported to India from the West. This is to put it very briefly, but you can pre-order your copy on Amazon now, and we're really excited about this piece of news. So we wanted to take this opportunity to share it with you. The other announcement, how do I get out of this? I think, sorry, just 1 second, yeah. Stop. Yeah, the other announcement that I wanted to make is our collaboration with Karwaan, the Heritage Exploration Initiative, which had originally hosted the lecture by Professor Thapar, which was the basis of this session, the Q&A today. And continuing from this session, we are now collaborating with them and hoping to organize a monthly series of similar conversations with scholars who have, been hosted by Karma. This is a group of students who are doing some amazing work over the past 1 year. Please look them up. Follow them on YouTube. They've got a wealth of content over there. And please look us up too. Please visit our website, History for Peace. Sign up, become a member. We too have some very valuable content over there. And join our community of history teachers across the subcontinent. And thank you for being here. Thank you again, Professor Thapar. It's been absolutely wonderful. And I think...
Closure.
Thank you. We shall end the meeting here, and I hope that we can do more such sessions with you in
Not likely. I dislike this technology too much.
well, then I hope that we get back to life as we knew it soon.
Yes, yeah. I keep on saying I'm a paper and pencil person.
Right. Thank you all.
I press leave. Samishta.